Hey, so we finished 1 Thessalonians last week, and my long-term plan this year was to come back to Mark, because you may not realize it. I didn't get any complaints from anybody, but we didn't finish Mark last November. And no one came to me and said, hey, where's the rest of Mark? Okay, so we're doing what I said. That's what we're going to do. So we're going back to Mark today. And it's timed so that since we got to near the end of Mark, we got maybe 2 chapters left in Mark. And so we timed it, bringing it back right now so that in 3 weeks, we'll be at Easter. Can you believe that? In 3 weeks, we'll be at Easter. So this is the lead up in Mark's narrative to Easter. So we're going to just use this to get back in the groove about the narrative story with Jesus. And that's where we come back to today. So to get you reoriented, since we've always been looking at this map of the Northern Aegean Sea and the second missionary journey of Paul. In fact, it's still on this map right here. It's see that little yellow squiggle up there? And that's Paul's second missionary journey. So that's where we were. So today we need to go back into Israel, and that's what we're going to do in Mark. And I had to do this for Carla Erskine. So Carla, if you're watching, here's your map. She always loves her maps at the beginning. So we're coming out of space down to the nation of Israel today, which is on the eastern Mediterranean. And we're going to zoom in on, don't get car sick, we're going to zoom in on the Sea of Galilee. So there we are at the Sea of Galilee, where almost all the action in Mark and the Gospels took place. A lot of it down in Jerusalem, which will be true today. But then as we rotate around to the northern end of the lake, we come around to where Jesus' home base, basically. We talked about this a lot. His home base was a fishing village called Capernaum. Or if you go there today, it's called Capharnaum. Capharnaum. Yeah, that's what it is. So here's the Sea of Galilee, and this was the operational center of what Jesus was doing. We're looking to the south. So at the top of the picture there is south, and so we're looking from the north to the south. And Capernaum is that little lump right there, right on the north end of the lake, and that's where Jesus did a lot of his center of base actions, especially through Mark. Mark sees that a lot. And what most people don't know is that the Jordan River flows into the Sea of Galilee from the north, and then it flows out of the Sea of Galilee in the south. So the Sea of Galilee is like a wide spot in the Jordan River. That's what it is. The water comes from the north, from Mount Hermon, where there's snow almost all during the year. It's a very high mountain. And like here, the mountain snow melts and it creates, streams that keep us alive and keep our plants going. That's the Jordan River there. It's the runoff melt from Mount Hermon, comes down, comes to the Sea of Galilee, and then flows down to the south, and then ends up without an outlet in the Dead Sea in the south. And the only way water comes out of the Dead Sea is by evaporation, which is why it's so salty. So that's our geography lesson for the day. You knew all about that. I come back to this picture because as we went into Mark, well, there's Jerusalem way over the hill. It's like way over there. You can't see it right here. In Mark, we had these 3 questions that we looked at over and over again. And this is what we wanted to answer as we were looking at Mark. And we're going to continue to answer these things today. The first one is, who is Jesus? Or in other words, what's his identity, the identity of Jesus? Why did he come? Or what was his mission? What did he come to accomplish? And then the third thing that's more applicable to us, I think, is what does Jesus demand of those who want to follow him? Or what's his call to us? Those are the 3 questions that we started into Mark to answer. And those questions will still be on our mind as we come to these last couple chapters of Mark. And so let's go back to where we were. Where were we? This was like the week before Thanksgiving, so I'm sure you've forgotten. Probably not. Week before Thanksgiving, we were in the courtroom of the priests, what I call the courtroom of the priests. So they've arrested Jesus, okay? Remember in the garden, they arrested Jesus, and now in the dead of night, they take him to what I call the kangaroo court of the priests, and they have a trial, because after all, these are legal, justice-oriented kind of religious leaders. You got to do things right. So in this trial, they try Jesus, but they do it opposite. Now in a courtroom today, you go to a courtroom today, and they do it in this sequence. First, they find out what the crime is, and then they arrest the man for the crime. However, in the courtroom of the priests, they do it the opposite way. They arrest the man, and then they look for the crime. That's actually an old Soviet adage, is that show me the man, I'll show you the crime. And that's how they used justice in the old Soviet Union to put people away they didn't like. Show me the man, I'll show you the crime. This is what the priests are doing. Show me the man, show me the crime. So at this point, last time, they were really frustrated because they kept bringing up all these false witnesses who would say, well, Jesus said this, or he said this, or he said he's going to tear down the temple. Remember all that stuff? And the reason that the priests rejected all that false testimony was it wasn't consistent. They were conflicting with each other. They couldn't get a straight message. If they'd said the same thing, the multiple witnesses would have been sufficient, but they just didn't get there. So in that confusion, finally, this logjam is broken, it turns out, and the high priest goes to Jesus and says, okay, here we go. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? Okay, are you the Messiah? By the way, you see right there, he calls God the Blessed, which is a way of not using the name of God. That's verboten. You don't do that. You don't write it. You don't say it. But the Blessed One, are you the Messiah? Let's be straight up. Are you the Messiah, Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus says, I am. And then to rub it in, now that we're still reviewing last time, then to rub it in, he says, not only I am, but then he goes on and says, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. In your face. So Jesus actually answers straight up, I am that Messiah. Well, at this point then, the high priests have everything they need to convict Jesus. Everything they need, because then the high priest tore his garments and said, well, what further witnesses do we need? We don't need any more false witnesses. I mean, you've heard his blasphemy. What's your decision? What's your decision? You've heard the blasphemy. Although we know it's not blasphemy. It's the truth. It's the truth. And one thing we're going to look at today as we go on in the new sections we'll look at is we're going to ask ourselves why it is that even in the presence of Jesus, people could not see that he was the Messiah. So we're going to talk about that more and more as we go on. Anyway, so he calls for a decision from the court, and the court then comes back, and they all condemned him as deserving death, because that kind of blasphemy, for you to say that I am God himself, that's blasphemy. That's blasphemy. So they finally get what they want, and they condemn him to death. Okay. Fast forward to today, we come into Mark 15. We start chapter 15, verse 1. We finish 14 right there with that recap. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. Why go to Pilate? Because they can't legally kill Jesus. They have condemned him to death in their court, but they can't kill him. So one of the deals, one of the arrangements that they have for peace and order in the area is the Jews said to the Romans, you keep peace here and we'll promise that we won't, disrupt that peace by killing people all over the place. Okay, so they take him to Pilate. So at this point, we've seen the high priests and the elders. They've seen Jesus face to face, which is the first time probably for many of them. They've been waiting to see this guy. Why is it that in Jesus' presence so many other people came to recognize who Jesus was, but the high priest didn't? The leaders didn't. Hold that question for a second, because now we're going to go to Pilate and ask the same question. So he goes off, and he's led to Pilate, and we're gonna spice up our stuff here with pictures from James Tissot, Jacques Tissot. And by the way, I might mention to you that in your bulletin we actually have an outline of what I'm going to talk about. So I'd love for you to tell me whether this helps you today. You can follow on here if you like, but just let me know if that's helpful, but we're going to follow that. And I have 3 sections in it as we go through today. And the first one is about the fact that magistrates, a.k.a. Pilate, often misunderstand who Jesus is. And there's a reason for this. There's a blindness that comes from this. And we're going to look at this blindness today of how it is you can be in the presence of the Son of God and still miss that he is the Son of God. How is that possible? So here's Pilate. They bring him to Pilate. And of course, you remember Pilate's reason to be, his call from Rome is, Pilate, go to Jerusalem, go to Israel, and just keep the peace there. Rome was all about keeping the peace. Yes, they are conquered. They are an occupied people. Now that they're an occupied people, the military's done. You just have to keep the peace. So in the early morning hours, it says it was just dawn, right? They had the trial at night. At dawn, what they do is they bring him to Pilate's house. Now, it turns out in another gospel, it says that they don't go into Pilate's house. Do you remember why? They would defile themselves just before Passover. You defile yourself if you walk into a Gentile's house. So what they do as a mob of leaders, they bring Jesus to the doorway at Pilate's house, and they give it to him. And they make their claims about who Jesus is, and he needs to die, he's causing a lot of disruption, and they make their case at the doorway of Pilate's house. But then Pilate says, Jesus, let's have a private discussion. Come on inside. So he brings Jesus inside, and that's when this discussion happens. The other guys are at the door. Probably the door's open. They're probably still shouting stuff into Pilate's house. But while they're inside, Pilate decides, let's have a private conversation. And so this is his private conversation with Jesus. This may also have been the first time Pilate had seen Jesus face to face. So Pilate asks him, based on the accusations at his doorway, so, are you the king of the Jews? And he answers, you have said so. Or in Greek, it's just 2 words. It just says, it's just 2 words. You say. You say. And idiomatically, we use this all the time. Is this true? Well, you said so, right? Depending on how you use these 2 words, it's not meant to challenge Pilate. It's meant for Jesus to agree with him, saying, you said it. You've said it. I am. So he basically agrees with this challenge that he is the king of the Jews. But the chief priests accuse him of many things. And I always imagine them standing at the doorway saying, well, that's not all, He said we shouldn't pay our money to Caesar. And then he said he's going to tear down the building of the temple. And he's just a radical guy. They're shouting more things inside. And here, Mark records that they were saying many things. More than just, are you the king of the Jews? Many things. And so Pilate hears that and says, do you have a response to that? So he asks him again, have you no answer to make? After all, see how many charges they bring against you? Do you have any more defenses? At which point, Jesus answers, nothing. Now, why not defend himself against these other charges? Why doesn't Jesus say, no, wait. I didn't actually say that I would tear down the stones of the temple. No, they got that wrong. No, I didn't. He doesn't go into a self-defense kind of mode. He's silent. And what you find in this gospel, which is consistent with the other gospels, the only thing Jesus responds to in all of these charges is, who are you? And he says, I'm the Christ. I am a king. So when it comes to the identity of who Jesus is, he says it straight up. But when it's all these other scurrilous charges, he doesn't bother defending himself. That's really not that important. To him, it is important to say, they say I'm the king of the Jews, and indeed I am. Straight up. And he doesn't muddy it or thin it out with other defensiveness. This kind of posture I've taken over the years personally, people will make strange and stupid accusations against you. Now you have a choice. Do you stand and you say, no, let me clarify that. That's totally wrong. And then you argue with them. No, I'm pretty sure it's true, and then you have this kind of stupid debate that has to do with these charges that are false. I have taken more and more over my life to just let those things roll off because they're silly. But when they come down to something more core issue, like with Jesus, like who are you? I'll say something about that. But when it comes to scurrilous charges, it's just not worth it. I've been in some situations where I've been in some very caustic situations, and I just chose not to answer the silly things. But I will answer the core things about who I am. My motivations were pure, and I would do them again. My motivations are out of love; they're not out of anything else. That's all there is to it. And then you forget about all the other stuff. People will, until the day you die, try to demean your stature in their presence by demeaning you, by lying about you, and even making accusations about you. And in the end, then they feel like they're bigger. Now, the reason I say this about these demeaning lies is we're in a presidential election year. Aren't we happy about this? Yeah, well, I don't know. Anyway, you will see the lion's share of the media you are going to consume is going to be about how bad the other guy is. And it's largely going to be false, I would guess. Some of it might have tiny threads into the truth. But that's the whole idea, is if you cannot promote yourself, and this is proven in political strategy, if you cannot promote yourself well enough, all you got to do is ding the other guy. Just ding the other guy so he goes down in people's eyes, and then you, as a result, since you're the last man standing, you go up. That's a much more productive way to sway people in your direction, is to badmouth the other guy. And this is the unfortunate truth in a political year. So I would say just let that roll off your back. Don't even believe a fraction of it when we come down to dirt saying on other people. It's not worth your time. All it's meant to do is to try and manipulate you and get your hackles up. So just let that go. Look more at the nature of the man based on what they do. And this is my political year tip. Jesus says, you'll know them by what they say. Oh, nope, I didn't say that. By what they do. They'll say anything, but it's what they do. So, judge the people that you want to have in power around us by looking at what they've done. Look at what they do and forget about the mudslinging. Okay. Jesus doesn't answer. And this section I stop with, and this is in your bulletin because this will make more sense a little bit later. One of the reasons why Pilate is not recognizing the truthfulness about who Jesus is his position. There's an arrogance that happens in our hearts. It's a court of pride, and we'll talk about arrogance later. But Pilate has what I call the arrogance of authority. He has the arrogance of authority. So in a real sense, those who are placed in authority, people that we elect into public offices, for instance, after a small amount of time, they start to tell themselves, well, I must be somehow superior because after all, I'm above them. They voted me in. They all realized that they weren't capable, but I am. I must have something special about me. I must have insight and wisdom that others don't have. There must be some way in which they recognize the obvious, and that obvious is, I'm kind of an elite in my society. Now, this is what authority sort of does. It doesn't have to happen to everybody, but it is a deception that happens when you're in that kind of position. And when your mind is in that set, you have an arrogance about you that causes you to be blind to things that are around you because you are so consumed with yourself, you can't see others. We'll come back to this later. So I call this run-in with Pilate. His blindness is because he has an arrogance of authority. He just doesn't see it. I'm in charge here. Let's push on in the story. When you go to verse 6, he moves on and says, now at the feast, Pilate used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. It was a nice gesture from the occupying power. When Passover comes around, I'll let one of your people out of jail. What do you say? I'll be magnanimous. So that comes around again. And among the people that were in prison at the time who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. So here we go, and then we're going to look at the mobs here, how the mobs didn't recognize who Jesus was. I call this mobs manipulating, and we'll talk more about that later. So anyway, what goes on in the story, verse 8? The crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. So we're just before Passover. So they say, you've released people in the past. We want you to release someone now. Well, based on the immediate history of talking with Jesus, he's thinking, they want me to release Jesus, right? So he answered them, saying, so do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? And Mark helps us in what he's thinking, because it says he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. So see, he's thinking Jesus was brought to his front door because, the leaders are envious of the growing power and influence, the popularity of Jesus, and that causes a problem for them. They're envious. So they just want him killed because he's a competitor. But I'm sure the people want Jesus. They seem to, like less than a week ago when he came in town on the donkey. I'll ask the people, who do you want me to release? It's probably Jesus, right? Right? Because you don't want him killed. It's just the leaders want him killed. And you know what? I'm on your side. I'll release him. So he makes this offer to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd. Literally, it means shaken. You put a rock in a box and you shake it. This is what the priests have done with the crowds. They've shaken and stirred them up. Why? To have him release for them Barabbas instead. Now, we don't know how they did this successfully. Because again, you remember, less than a week before, he was coming down the Mount of Olives on this donkey to huge accolades of everyone in town. Did those people change their mind now just a handful of days later? Or did something else happen? Did the high priest realize that this was going to be a decision that Pilate was going to be prone to satisfy the people? Because after all, he's all about the peace. And the Pharisees probably thought, so what happens if we come to Pilate and tell him you need to kill Jesus? And then that's going to make everybody angry because these crowds wanted Jesus, and then we're going to have more of an uproar. No, we can't. So high priest figured, I know what we'll do. We'll take the whole equation of the people out of it. And what we'll do is we'll come up with an artificial group of people who don't want Jesus instead of the people who wanted Jesus when he came in town. I don't really believe that the people who welcomed Jesus into town changed their mind at this point. I think the Pharisees handpicked a mob. I think they handpicked a mob. It makes more sense in so many ways because Jesus' ministry, even around the temple during the week, there were a lot of people around. So there, that momentum from coming into town really was still there. I think the Pharisees handpicked a mob. This is how you do things. This is how you do things today. It's exactly how you do things today. Even if the majority of the populace wants something else, you can still find enough discontent people. Maybe, I don't know, you pay them. Maybe you do something. You get them all worked up, or you just shake them like a rock in a box. You shake them and make them mad about something, and you make them very vocal, and you tell them, you need to be outside Pilate's window on that morning when we accuse Jesus, and we want you to be antagonistic against Jesus. In fact, if he asks for you who you want released, say Barabbas, not Jesus. I think they made an artificial mob, and they got enough people together so that they could make appeal to Pilate, who's up there saying, what do I do with Jesus? He's presuming he's going to do a nice thing and release Jesus. But as he looks at the crowd, he realizes if he releases Jesus, he's going to have a mob that's going to have an insurrection because the Pharisees put him up to it. So Pilate's job is peace. And he realizes if he releases Jesus, there's not going to be peace among the people. At least it looks like that because the mob doesn't want Jesus, they want Barabbas. And it's an artificial populace that the Pharisees have put up. But they know it's persuasive. So Pilate again says to them, so then what shall I do with the man that you call the King of the Jews? By the way, it looked like the mob was calling Jesus the King of the Jews when he came into town on the donkey. So he says, you called him the King of the Jews. What shall I do with him? What are you doing? And of course, they cried out again, well, crucify him. Again, I think this was a training from the Pharisees. Ask for Barabbas, ask for Pilate to crucify him, and then threaten you'll riot if you don't do what they say. See, this is how you manipulate your leaders. So Pilate said to them, well, why? What evil has he done? He's actually going to he's going to reason with the mob. This is going to work out well. He's going to reason. Well, so what has he done? And they said, crucify him. They wouldn't answer. You know why? Because they weren't prepped on that part of the story. No, the Pharisees just said, ask for Barabbas and force, or you'll riot even worse, force Pilate to crucify him. Yeah, but what did he do wrong? Crucify him. They weren't prepped on that one. They weren't prepped. So they didn't say anything back. Well, in the end, Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, see, there it is. This is how mobs work. In order to satisfy the crowd, or you can kind of cross that out and say, in order to keep the peace, release for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And there's a picture, I love this picture by Tissot, behind showing him washing his hands, which the other gospels say he does. He symbolically said, I wash my hands of this affair. I'm not involved in this. I mean, you did this. I'll give you what you ask. I'm not guilty. Okay. This end of this section, the mobs, is a very fascinating thing right here. And I call this, their blindness to who Jesus is, I call the arrogance of numbers. Arrogance of numbers. Hey, have you ever been in a crowd of people where you felt like you're in the minority about something? Well, everyone else is in the majority, and they're thinking, we're right because we have the numbers. But if you have the numbers, you're not always necessarily right. So there is an arrogance that comes because you feel like you're supported by the numbers of people around you. But the fact that you're in the majority doesn't necessarily mean you're right. And I think this is part of what's going on in the minds of these people. Why they don't see Jesus as being the Savior. Why they don't actually react to the manipulation of the Pharisees? Because it says the Pharisees shook them up. The Pharisees did this to them. Why don't they look at the Pharisees and say, "You guys are dirtbags. This man has done wonderful things all this week in the temple. We've seen healings. He teaches wise things." How are they so susceptible to that kind of manipulation by the Pharisees? But in the end, the more of them there were, the more they thought, well, we must all be right because we have the numbers. So there's an arrogance that comes from that. Your mind's kind of twisted. Let's go to a third group of people because, this is what he did. They manipulated them, and then they suddenly felt like they were in the right because they had the numbers. 16. So the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters. The praetorium is the real word for it. And they called together the whole battalion. So now you gotta picture this. This is really something. They take Jesus and they don't put him out in the courtyard outside. They take him into Pilate's place of business, the praetorium. Inside. They take him inside, and then they call a whole bunch of other soldiers. How many? It says here a battalion. If you look at this word, it actually means, sometimes it will say cohort, depending on your translation. But almost all Bible scholars agree this is a fraction of a legion. Now, a legion is 6,000 soldiers. A legion is 6,000 soldiers. This is usually a tenth of that. So it's 600 soldiers, say. These might have been the guys who were tasked with protecting Pilate himself. There was probably a cohort, 600 soldiers that were there. So what they decide to do, instead of taking him out to be crucified, they say, well, let's have a little fun first. So what do? You go inside the praetorium where these guys live protecting Pilate, and they decide to have a little fun with Jesus first before they take him out and scourge him and crucify him. They go inside to have a humiliation party at Jesus' expense. They go inside Pilate's house to do this. And there's hundreds of them. So what did they do? Well, for fun, they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. They're mocking him inside the praetorium, inside Pilate's house, inside the place of power. They're doing this to Jesus. Okay, Tissot got the color of the robe wrong. Did you notice that? That's a little not really close to purple. But what is interesting is that purple is a royal color, right? Because purple was a very expensive color to dye cloth with. So only the richest people had purple stuff. If you have purple stuff in your house, you're dressed like a king or a queen, right? Where did they get this purple robe from when they're in the praetorium of Pilate's house? Maybe Pilate? He would be the only one in that house who would have purple cloth. Was this with Pilate's blessing? Yeah, probably. They came inside the praetorium. They came inside the house. They wanted to mock Jesus as a king. Does anyone have any purple? Oh, Pilate does. Can we borrow that? Yeah. Okay. And they use that and they mock him with that coat. And then they also, you need a crown. You need a crown. So a popular plant around the area is this crown of thorns. My mom had a crown of thorns planted at our house that was planted in a pot inside. Nasty. It's nasty. I mean, the vine itself, it's like a long vine kind of thing. It's not like a bush. It's like a long viney thing. And the vine part is, it's about the size of a pencil diameter. And then it's got these 1.5-inch long spikes down the length of it. And these tiny little leaves, tiny, like the size of peas. Every now and then, but there's spikes. It's a vine with spikes and a few leaves. And I used to remember looking at that as a kid thinking, who would keep a plant like this in their house? I understand philodendrons. Those are cool looking. I understand, a lot. Wandering Jew, that's really a wonderful kind of plant. It's green stuff. This is not a very green plant. It's a painful plant. And I remember looking eye to eye at the table level at this stupid plant thinking, why would my mom keep such a nasty plant? And I poked myself on it a number of times. And then she finally explained it to me. Well, if you take that and you wrap it up into a crown, you can put it on someone's head. Why would you put that on someone's head? Well, to mock them being king. And then I heard the story and I go, oh, okay, I get it. But it's a nasty plant. So they make a crown. And they're doing this in Pilate's house. I think with his blessing, mocking him as king. By the way, these scenes are so hard to see. I mean, at least for you and for me who love Jesus, this kind of humiliation, it's just hard. It's hard to see. I mean, I struggled this week even rereading these and even seeing Tissot's pictures of them. But I have to constantly remind myself, this is not included in the Bible in order to just make, to make some kind of lurid attraction about the violence of it all. This is for you to understand what love looks like. So when you see these images, think, this is how much he loved me. This is what he was willing to go through. This is the same person who created the universe. And he's putting up with this voluntarily. This is love. Just keep reminding yourself. I had to put that in because I see this picture and it makes me crazy. They began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews. There's actually truth coming out of their mouth, but they're using it to hate. You know who's really good at using the truth to hate and destroy? Satan is. Satan is. What did he say to Eve? Oh, God didn't really say that. The temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Throw yourself off this thing here and the angels will pick you up and keep you from hurting yourself. And, and in a way, Satan is using truth to hatefully go against Jesus. And then Jesus uses truth to back it off, Anyway, this is what Satan does. There's truth coming out of this man's mouth, but he's using it to hate. And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. In Matthew's gospel, I think it says they take the reed and they give him a reed to put in his hand too. So it looks like a scepter, right? So they sit him down on a chair. They put the crown of thorns on his head. They put the purple on him. And they give him something weak and useless like a reed to kind of make fun of the fact that kings have scepters that mean something. Kings who have scepters use them to symbolically bring judgment. Like, for instance, if you remember the story about Esther, Esther went and her husband was the king, but she had to go into the king's presence unwelcomed, uninvited, which usually brings death. And in the story of Esther, that scepter in the king's hand really plays a prominent role because it says that he could have taken that scepter and go, dead. That would be his judgment on her. So scepters were actually a visible symbolic statement of the power and judgment. But in Esther's story, the scepter stayed next to him and was not used to kill Esther. He listened to Esther instead. You've never read Esther. If you've never read Esther, read it in the next couple weeks because in the Jewish calendar, they celebrate Esther's story in the next couple weeks in March. And you know what they do? They read it aloud in synagogue. We've done that here. But we're not going to do this. Okay. So they kneeled down. They paid homage to him. They used some of these reeds and hit him on the head. They spit on him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, because after all, it was only borrowed from probably Pilate. So they take that out. We can't take that out to the crucifixion. They give that back. They put on his own clothes on him, and then they lead him out to crucify him. And then finally they go out to crucify. This is an interesting picture right here because as they lead him out of Pilate's place, you see the palm fronds right here? They continue the mocking of him as king by using the same thing they used to welcome him in town less than a week before. I think that's why Tissot's picture is really nice that way. He's king. Hey, I'll go get that palm frond and we'll do what we did when he came in town. Yeah. I call this, since we're talking about the military largely, this is the arrogance of power. When you have that kind of power, it's going to be very hard for you to acknowledge and recognize the power of Jesus himself. Power is something that gives you an immediate arrogance over everyone else that's weaker than you. I've got the gun, I've got the artillery, I've got the bombs, I've got the power, and you don't. It's hard for you to recognize power that is unstated and subtle. And that's who Jesus is. Now, throughout the ministry of Jesus, we see his power poke out so many times, and we know this. I mean, he does miracles in healing people. He's got power over demons. Who in the world would have the nerve to come up to that guy on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee who was jumping around on graves without any clothes on, and he was so strong people couldn't keep him together? They put chains around him and he broke them. Who in the world would have the nerve to walk up with a man of such overt power and say, get out of him? Except someone with great power. Someone who had power over not only the seen but the unseen universe. I mean, Jesus demonstrated his power so many times. It was probably legendary. These were things that are talked about. But now when you get in the presence of the military, we've got the power. You don't. And look, we know we have the power over you because we're subduing you. You're not subduing us. It blinds you because of the arrogance of that power to who this Jesus is. And yet they had an up-close seat on the King of Kings. And somehow watching him didn't change your mind about who he was. Now, I keep saying this. You say, well, what did Jesus do even here that would kind of tempt them to think that maybe Jesus is more than who he says? Look, this happened in the story later on when we get to the crucifixion. Remember, there's a centurion right there at the crucifixion spot that when Jesus finally dies and in the temple, you know, the veil is rent from top to bottom. There's an earthquake. I mean, it's a crazy moment. It's dark from noon until 3 in the afternoon. And after all this happens and Jesus dies, that centurion goes, well, he was the Son of God. He changed his mind. He saw something that changed his mind. And even more subtle is you've got the thief on the cross. He changed his mind based on what he saw in Jesus during this horrible time. How do you know? Well, because a couple of the Gospels say that at the beginning of the crucifixion, both of the thieves were hurling abuses at Jesus. Both of them were. And then in one gospel it says at the end, well, but this one of the two of them changed his mind and actually appealed to Jesus as the king when you come into your kingdom. Can I be with you? I mean, that's my paraphrase of it. When you come into your kingdom, he actually appeals to the character and nature of Jesus as a king. How did he figure that out? And then instead of a king who's going to be full of judgment and wrath against his sinfulness, somehow he understands the grace and the mercy of the king in order to say, when you come into your kingdom, think of me. How do you understand that Jesus was the king, Jesus had mercy, and Jesus had the grace to invite him into his kingdom? How do you know that? What did he see from the cross? So throughout this entire process, I have to believe that even though we just see the violence that's visited upon Jesus, it's the way he suffered through this violence that changed people's idea about who he was. He was silent largely through it, but there's an unspoken character of it that I wish we had a video of it. This is the difference between reading a novel that's written on a piece of paper and watching a stage play of it. When you look at a stage play of it, you can actually communicate motives and intentions without any words at all, just by how faces make expressions, how you carry your body. And I happen to believe that in this entire violent scene that we're seeing right here, there's something about how Jesus carried himself and how Jesus looked at people that made people realize, I think he's doing this voluntarily. There's something going on here that we can't write on words. I mean, there's something happening because the thief on the cross changed and the centurion changed. And I think other people changed. I think it was really how Jesus went through this was really an in-your-face statement even to the Pharisees, how he went through it. But we don't have it documented right here. But I'm pretty sure that this power that the military had was a factor in them not being able to see it. We have the power. You don't. Don't call yourself a king. Okay, let's do a little wrap up because that's all we're going to cover today.
Sorry,
Sure.
I think the crowd heard Jesus say today, "You will be with me in paradise."
Oh, did the crowd hear Jesus say, today you'll be with me in paradise? I think so. Someone wrote it down because they heard it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Or when Jesus came back, he told them the story. That could be true too. Yeah.
I'm trying to find it and I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
When did he say, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do"?
When he was on the cross. I can't remember which gospel it's in though, because that's what you're going to have to do is find out which gospel. But that's a good point. That would tell you something is going on that more than meets the eye here. Yeah, that's a really good point. I was saying there's probably nonverbal cues about how he suffered it, but there's a very verbal cue right there. You're totally right. Yeah, that's good. And I'll ask you another question that I don't know the answer to, and you don't either, but it's fun to think about. So the scene we just saw when he was in front of the priest, they ask him in their frustration because their false testimonies aren't working. They ask him, "So are you the Messiah?" And he says, "I am." Now, here's the question. Did he say that in Hebrew or in Greek or in Aramaic? Now, he's in front of guys who make a living speaking Hebrew, the pure Hebrew. Do you think that he used the same word, "I am," that God did when Moses asked God, "Look, God, if I go back to the Israelites, they're going to ask me who's sending me. So who do I say your name is?" This is Exodus 3. Yeah. And God says, "Tell them I am that I am."
Is it possible that somehow all different languages could understand?
Probably.
Particular.
But I've always wondered whether Jesus wanted to rub it in with him about who he was. Are you the Messiah? And he uses the same word that God uses in response to Moses. Yeah. Hiya asher haya. I am that I am. I don't know. I don't know. But he's in a crowd of people who are the most literate in Hebrew, and they're asking him a Hebrew question about the King of the Jews. I think he said, "Hiya, hiya." In Hebrew, I am. Hiya. It looks like hiya, hiya. It's hiya, hiya. Hiya asher, that I am, hiya. And that Yah part that you hear in Yahweh, that is M. That's the word for being, for existence. I am existence. Yeah. Hiya asher, Yah. In Greek, it's, I forget. Ego imi. Ego is like ego. Ego, I. Imi is the word to be. So, ego imi. I think. You can check me on that. But I like hiya. I think he answered in Hebrew. Exactly the same words that God said to Moses. "Who should I say you are?" Hiya, Yah. I am. Okay, let me talk about arrogance for a second. Because this is really operative in why a lot of people probably didn't pick up who Jesus is. I said it was an arrogance of something, arrogance of something, arrogance of something. I had to look up arrogance, and I love this definition. Arrogance is having or revealing an exaggerated sense of one's own importance or abilities. And if you have an exaggerated sense of who you are, that arrogance is going to blind you from seeing more important things than you. And so that's why I use this arrogance in these things, this arrogance of power. They have an exaggerated sense of their power, of who they are. Do they have more power than the King of the universe who made the world? No. But in that arrogance, they have an exaggerated sense that keeps them from seeing the one who has real power. Or what about the one about the arrogance of numbers? We think that if we're in the majority, if everyone speaks the same way that we speak, it builds an arrogance that you must be more in the right than you actually are. You have an exaggerated sense of what's true because everyone agrees with me. And this is one of the principal problems in the internet world these days. You live in a bubble where everyone, by your selection, says the same thing you do, and then you feel like I must be right. And so then when you bring to them some truth about, but you need to think about who Jesus is, the creator of the universe. Go, well, no. Everyone that I know in the numbers of the people that I associate with, they agree with me. Jesus is nothing. There's an arrogance that comes from the fact that all the voices that you hear say the same thing you do. And just a public service message. The internet is designed to increase this effect on you. When you look at things, when you mark things that you like, the internet makes money off the fact that you can characterize who you are based on those likes so that we can shoot ads to you that'll be more productive. And then they also realize that they want you to stay online as long as possible to see the ads because they make more money with the ads. So they will, based on what your input into the system, put voices there that are most like your own. And then you'll feel like you're in a nice crowd of people who think the same way I do. This is an automatic way to keep your eyes on the screen and also get stuff to you. It will amplify the bubble factor in your life because it will deliberately keep away people that don't agree with you. Because if you start hearing too many voices of people who disagree with you, you're not going to tune in anymore. So I just want to warn you, that's a well-known algorithm in the internet, a well-known algorithm that will basically make you think the more you look at it, the more you feel like you're in the right because everybody feels the way I do. Who's everybody? Well, everybody the internet allows you to look at. I'm just saying. You know this, right? Okay. Just saying. But there's an arrogance that comes from that. You can be in the vast majority and be vastly wrong, especially when it comes to who is Jesus. And I think that's what's happening right here. Part of that's happening to the crowd. And then we talked about the arrogance of authority. This one very much is kind of an elitism kind of thing. Authority thinks that it's better than everyone else. It really fits the arrogant definition of having an exaggerated sense of self. And people who are given authority, who are put in positions of power, tend to sort of talk to themselves and say, I must know better than everyone else because, after all, I'm in charge. So I must be superior in some kind of way. And that kind of self-centered superiority blinds you to the reality of things going on. You are so self-centered in that case, you can't see it. And I think that's true with Pilate as well. After all, I was sent here by Caesar to make things peaceful here in Israel. And you claim to be the king of the Jews? Ha! I'm a governor of an area. I know what kings look like, and you're not it. You see the arrogance of that? That can blind you. So all of these things add up to what I call the blindness of pride. The blindness of pride, an over exaggeration of estimation of who you are can totally blind you to some very important things, especially the most important thing, who is Jesus? Is he the King of Kings? He is. But when you're stuck in authority and elitism, when you're stuck in the majority of numbers because everyone thinks like me, and when you're stuck in the fact that I have power and he doesn't, you're going to miss it. Pride goes before the fall. That's why these things, pride is an over-exaggeration of who you are. And when we get to the point where we finally come to Jesus, many of us have to be pushed off the cliff of this kind of pride. And then you crash at the bottom of the cliff and your life falls apart. It falls apart by the design of God. And basically when you get down to the end of that and you're smushed on the ground and all the circumstances of life are telling you in loud voices, you are less than you think you are. You do not deserve anything. Everything's falling apart. You thought you were in control. You thought you were in power. You thought you were in lead. All that stuff is wrong. And what are you going to do now? And in that humility you go, I think I need God. I think there's something to what he was saying. Humility is not going lower in estimation than who you are. It's just going to normal. It's going to normal. Arrogance is about hyperextending your exaggeration of who you are. And when you're in that position, God's voice can't be heard. Many of us have come to Jesus as a result of these crashes. And these crashes bring a wake-up call of humility to us. And we realize that maybe I am not the master of my ship. Maybe indeed I need something more than me, because all these arrogances right here are all about over-exaggerations of me. And we have to get off those things. God says, I'm not going to share my kingdom with people who are strutting around saying, I'm an elite and I'm in the majority and I've got some power. He's not going to let you in the kingdom like that. And you're not going to recognize that Jesus is all these things. He is the authority. He is the majority holder in the universe, and he has the power. And it's not you. But I think all these factors contributed to them not being able to see who Jesus was, even though they had a front row seat on how the King of Kings submits to injustice. And they wouldn't bend. I think this is fascinating. Okay, let me go back to our Sea of Galilee thing. We said, who is Jesus? Why did he come? What does Jesus demand of those who want to follow him? And we found out that when we got to Mark 8, those things were answered in like a couple of sentences right next to each other. Woo-hoo! So if anyone ever asks you about these questions, just go to Mark 8 and find these because they're right next to each other. You've seen them. And we found out the answer is this. Who is Jesus? Well, Jesus is the Son of God. He's the promised Messiah from the Old Testament. Why did he come? His necessary mission was to be killed and then to be raised from the dead. This is right there. And that we're in the process of that happening in this part of the narrative. And so what does Jesus demand of those who want to follow him? Well, to deny yourself, to take up your cross and follow Jesus. Now we read that last one, and it starts to come in high relief now that we get close to the crucifixion of Jesus. And you say to yourself, you mean wait, we have to follow in Jesus' footsteps that we're kind of opening up right now in Mark 15 and 16? Will that happen to us? Will we suffer that kind of injustice? Well, right now we don't. Well, no, wait, I should just take it back. We do. It depends on where you live, and there's a lot of circumstantial stuff. There's a lot of persecution of Christians worldwide in very overt ways. And I get a newsletter from a fellow who just, all he does every time when he sends the newsletter out is he just tallies up how Christians have been dealt with around the world. And I got to tell you, the worst stories come out of Nigeria. I'm not biased against Nigeria, but there's just a grotesque and overt persecution, violent persecution of Christians in Nigeria. And they're really not alone in Nigeria. There's many other countries that do this, but Nigeria just happens to hit the headlines these days, where they actually go to Christian schools, they kidnap the kids, mostly the girls, and they sexually abuse them, they burn down the schools, they burn down churches. This is going on in 2024 in the world. But we sit in our bubble again and think, well, I don't know. Someone gave me a bad look the other day when I said the name of Jesus. I feel persecuted. Well, I think it's going to get worse. I just got to tell you, I think it's going to get worse. And these three blindness syndromes, you're going to actually face up against quite a lot for the other people. I mean, there will be people who have power who figure that because you look weak and they have power, your message must be wrong. And yet, we're told that God uses the weak to confound the people with power. Yeah, I think this was part of the testimony of Jesus as he suffered through these things. He acted weak, although he had all the power. God confounds the people who have this blindness because of their arrogance of power. I'm in power, you're not. I don't have to listen to you. And I think we'll also run up against the other one. This one especially so, this arrogance of numbers. Well, people will say, you Christians, there's only a few of you around, and the rest of us all agree it's a bunch of hooey. I can quote you experts after experts after experts who say Christianity is not what it is. They'll say it's all a lie. I mean, they'll use the numbers argument to say you're just wrong. Because how can you be right and all of us wrong? You mean you're saying all of us are wrong? Well, yeah. Yeah, maybe you've run up against this already, because I have. All the time I run up against this. This is also an actual argument that's used in the public when there's disagreements about things. and many people will appeal to, well, I'm part of the majority. Did you know that 97% of scientists agree with what I'm saying? But so you've seen this. You've seen this. There's an arrogance that comes with this sense of numbers. I'm in the majority. But look, what you know about Jesus doesn't change based on how many people disbelieve it. It's still true. It's still true. Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's the promised Messiah. He died on our behalf so that we can avoid the wrath of God because he took God's wrath in our place. And now he invites us to his kingdom. That's all true. Even if the majority says, well, 100% of us disagree with you, so you must be wrong. It's not possible that so many people can be wrong. Well, actually. The arrogance of stupidity. No, it's just really the arrogance of numbers. And and now before you get too haughty about this, we're all prone to this. We're all prone to this. Because your backbone is stronger when you're here in the majority of people who agree with you. And then when you go out as a minority and the people that don't agree with you, you shift a little bit. You know what I'm saying? So we're all prone to this. So be compassionate to people who side with the majority. who claim numbers must show truth, because it's not true. Didn't happen here either. And then finally, you will get this all the time. You'll get this arrogance, this overestimation of their rightness based on, I would say, their eliteness. Like we're superior, we understand. You're just common, simple folk that don't understand what's going on, and you cling to your God, and he's not real. Look, I went to university. I've got a PhD. I can tell you. I'm in charge of my city. I can tell you. I'm in charge of my state. I can tell you. I'm clearly a special superior person because I wouldn't be in my position if that wasn't true. So what you're thinking is just totally wrong. You'll get this all the time, and you can just smell the pride. But the arrogance is an overestimation of who you are. So it tends to blind. It tends to blind. And for people in that position especially, I hate to say it, but God's going to have to bring them low before they can recognize the supremacy of Christ. This is just how it works.
It's like the arrogance of the LDS. They think they're going to have their own planet, and they believe Jesus is their brother.
Yeah, this is common. And by the way,
That's
like I say, before you get too condemning of people who are prone to these things, you are too. You have been. And if it weren't for the grace of God, you'd be stuck in these things too. So be compassionate about the victims of sin who are prone to overestimate who they are, and as a result are blind to who Jesus is. And that's why I call it a blindness. It's really a blindness because the pride has blinded them, because they've made themselves bigger than God and they can't see anymore. They can't see anymore. Am I done? Yes. So we're going to sing this song.
One final before.
Yes.
How many miles is from one end to the other? Sea of Galilee.
7 miles wide,
7 miles.
12 miles long.
Okay.
It's almost identical.
7 by 12.
It's almost identical in size to Utah Lake.
Ah.
Almost identical, especially in width. Yeah. That was our trivia geography for the morning. So you can, despite those 3 arrogance factors, you can continue to proclaim that Jesus is the King, and there'd be nothing wrong with what you're saying. The facts are the facts. The truth is the truth. Don't let the arrogance and pride of those who oppose you put you off your game. It's just true. It's true. And so stick to that because they need to hear that. Okay? By the way, if God does indeed have in their future a crash and burn scenario in order to knock down that arrogance, they need to know who to call out to. So you need to continue to tell them that Jesus is the one who binds up broken hearts. Jesus is the one who's the King of Kings. Jesus is the one who loves you so much that he put up with this, that we might be part of his kingdom. They need to hear that even while they're making fun of you. Okay? So, Father in heaven, we do indeed thank you for these passages. Our hearts break to see the one who we've come to love, to see so mistreated. And yet, Lord, it's the dimension of his love that elevates my heart. Such sacrifice, such determination, such persistence. And Lord, it reminds me of all the psalmists who said that your loving kindness is everlasting. It will not stop. It will not be stopped. And here in Jesus, as he marches toward the cross, we see love that will not be stopped. And he allows himself, the one who created us, who created the rocks, that created the trees on which the cross was manufactured, the one who makes the sun shine and the moon orbit. He's the one who willingly dies on our behalf. So, Lord, we pray that you would take our eyes and give us eyes that are melted by that kind of love, that persistence of that kind of love. And, Lord, continue to create in us hearts that are willing to sacrifice to communicate your love to a lost and fallen world who so desperately need you, but they haven't figured it out yet. So thank you again for this passage in Jesus' name. Amen.